Photography has always fascinated me because it allows us to view time in a way that our eyes and minds can't perceive. I recall reading a quote from a photographer discussing two photographs that they'd made one after the other. Both images were in essence exactly the same, apart from one was made with flash and the other wasn't, however creating two distinctly different images. The photographer then questions which one of these images was reality. I always liked that thought because I feel that long exposure photography sits somewhere in that same space. Well, I'm sure we've all seen images of waterfalls, streams, and even star trails in a night sky being captured in a way that shows motion, and at some point in our photography endeavour, we've always had the inkling of giving it a go at least once. Though I always struggled trying to create something locally, as Norfolk isn't really famous for its waterfalls or mountainous streams. However, after stumbling across a few photographs, and one in particular by Michael Kenner, my opinion on long exposure photography changed. Michael Kenner isn't strictly a long exposure photographer, but his overall aesthetic is what made me think differently, and in particular his minimal and contrasty style. One other thing that stood out to me was that water doesn't have to be the main element in the scene to utilise long exposure. It seems obvious now, but until I saw it in other images, I wouldn't have considered it, and that was clouds. So what is long exposure photography? I suppose to keep it simple without going off on too many tangents, I would describe it as the process of capturing something stationary while also blurring, smearing, or obscuring the moving elements within the same frame. Because of that very general description, it's hard to specify an exact exposure duration that clarifies a photograph as long exposure, as it kind of completely depends on the scene that you're capturing. What do I mean by this? Well, here are a couple of examples. The one on the left was shot using a shutter speed of 1/3 of a second, while the one on the right was likely about a minute or even longer. To me, I would class them both as long exposure images because of these two very drastic time differences. Technically, a long exposure could even be with faster shutter speeds, though the general consensus is when a photograph is made with longer shutter speeds. Because images are made with long shutter speeds, it's unlikely they're going to be made handheld, so a tripod is highly recommended. Also, depending on how long of an exposure you're aiming for, you'll also likely need the tripod to be robust enough that it's not going to move or wobble during that exposure, as any kind of movement could be captured, causing unwanted blurring or softness of the image. Some tripods even allow it to be weighted down. Another must piece of equipment which is linked to reducing camera movement is a cable release. For the film cameras that I've used, 1 second is generally the slowest shutter speed available before you have to start using bulb. However, even at those speeds, using something like a cable release stops any unwanted camera movements. Part of the process of creating long exposures requires you to increase shutter speed long enough to capture that movement. There are a few ways that you can do this, either stop down the aperture or shoot during the morning or evenings when there's less light. Though, what if you wanted to photograph when there's just too much light around to get those super long exposures? Well, that's when you'll need to use filters. There are two categories of filters that I use when shooting black and white film, and they are ND or neutral density filters and color filters. Both types of filters reduce the light that travels through the lens and have different strengths, with coloured filters actually limiting part of the visible light spectrum, which also allows the change on how the light is rendered on the film. However, I won't be talking about that today. Metering a scene and how you do this is really up to you. Just to be aware that if you're using strong ND filters, your built-in camera sensors may struggle with the amount of reduced light, so calculating is normal and then adjusting for those filters might be easier. One aspect of long exposure film photography that I need to talk about is something called reciprocity failure. So what is reciprocity failure? Well, let's have a read what Ilford has to say. Low intensity reciprocity failure describes a phenomenon where if the same total exposure is given to photographic material over a longer period of time, then the density of the image generated is lower, effective speed is reduced. It is caused by a reduced efficiency in forming stable development centres with low levels of light. To keep it simple, the longer the film is exposed to light, the less sensitive the film becomes, meaning longer exposure times must be compensated beyond the norm, otherwise it's likely that you'll underexpose the frame. When do we have to calculate reciprocity failure? The majority of film doesn't need to be compensated until exposure times exceed above 1 second. However, there are film stocks which allow for longer exposures before needing to calculate for this. Because all film stock is different, it's best to seek something called a film datasheet, which should be available on manufacturers' websites. How do we calculate reciprocity failure? As mentioned before, datasheets are often the best place to find this, as they can sometimes display graphs, though some datasheets may even show this as an exponential number, which can be used in scientific calculators. This may all seem very complicated at first, but it's actually pretty easy, and here's how. Let's use Ilford HP5 as our film stock example. Meter the scene like you normally would and take note of the suggested shutter speed. Let's imagine it reads 10 seconds. Well, according to the graph on the datasheet, if we find our time on the bottom and follow up until the black curved line, and then follow horizontally across to the left vertical reading, it gives us an adjusted time of 20 seconds. Another way is to use the p-factor number on the calculator. If we look at the list given by Ilford, they suggest using 1.31. All you need to do is type in the seconds, which in this case is 10, and then to the power of 1.31, and the answer is 20.4. However, there's an even easier way, and that's with an app. There are several available, though the one that I use in particular is called Reciprocity Timer. It has a large selection of films, but the one thing that I also like about it is that it allows you to apply filters to its calculations. And when you're kind of out about on location, all I really want to be doing is making images instead of calculating maths. So with all of that, let's see if we can put it into practical use.
Not too far from the heart, there's a star who have me as a reminder when it stings. When you're busy growing up, know that I'm right here.
I decided to drive out to the port town of Felixstowe, as there was a shot that I'd always wanted to create. I thought it might be a good place to show how I used to create my long exposure photographs. However, I was reluctant, as over the years the location became quite popular.
Let me clear every path, my dear, we will steer you through.
The first thing I do is walk around the scene with the camera handheld, looking for compositions. This way I'm able to move more freely without a tripod getting in the way. Once I've found something I like, then I'll put the camera on the tripod.
That's where courage lies. When you're busy growing up, know that I'm right here. When everything is messed up and it feels like no one cares.
The next thing I'll do is meter the scene. Each scene is different and might depend on also the look you want to create, but generally I take a reading on the most brightest and darkest parts of the frame, and a couple others that I think should be included. The Sekonic will then give me an average reading, where I will then scan the scene again, checking that certain parts aren't too over or underexposed. Once I'm happy with the reading, I'll open up Reciprocity Timer on my phone, taking note of the shutter speed, and all I'll do is play around with the exposure comp slider and filter add-ons until I'm happy with the time that I think will work. The length of the time is really scene dependent and really up to you as a photographer.
But everything is messed up, and it feels like no one cares. When you're busy growing up, know that I'm right here. But everything is...
As there was little to no wind, I decided to aim for 1 to 2 minutes. I'll also bracket multiple shots of the same frame, just in case one exposure looks better over the other.
Turn to me.
When the scenery is riding, just 'cause I'm too proud, whisper away my outdated doubts. Somebody do me out. We'll tornadoes, we'll drink morning dew, and we'll be lovers, me and you. 'Cause the crazy fools feeling young. Oh, we're crazy fools feeling young.
And that's pretty much it. Unfortunately, on this particular day, it seems that the tide was at its lowest when I arrived and wasn't going to be back again until after sunset. One thing you'll come to realise is that there's a lot of standing around and waiting, but after a while, I actually found it quite calming and peaceful, being able to take in and appreciate the landscape that we stand in. And it was that same feeling that I wanted to translate in those images. Even though long exposure photography can be daunting, especially when using film, I hope it's been able to at least help in one aspect or another. As always, thanks for watching.